Hello, I'm Infamous Fear. What's that? It's time for a special! There's a certain kind of film which nobody dares to touch. Call it culture. These films are so designated as art that not only do people avoid critiquing them, but they're almost too terrified to watch them at all. There's a danger here that a film will maintain some kind of lofty reputation without ever really being examined, kept in a kind of mysterious, untouchable category. We think of these films as artistic perfection because we're being told to, and we have no desire to find out for ourselves. Do we fear looking stupid if we think otherwise? Now, I admit that this whole preamble sounds rather like something someone would say before gleefully shitting on a film's grand reputation, in an act of almost bull-headed anti-intellectualism. But it bears mentioning this strange mindset, because today I'm going to be looking at a film so classic that I almost dare not speak its name. So, I'm going to have Gender Hips to do it for me. Lawrence of Arabia.
In the desert, you can remember your name, 'cause there ain't no one for to give you no pain.
Ah yes, Lawrence of Arabia. This 1962 film was directed by celebrated filmmaker David Lean, a man best known for his sweeping epics. This is a Patreon request by Caroline, someone who clearly decided to give me a challenge. On the one hand, Lawrence of Arabia is considered one of the greatest films ever made, lauded for its incredible scope and astounding artistic beauty. On the other hand, there's several odd and rather unfortunate things to consider. The legacy of British colonialism, a context modern viewers may no longer understand, and a running time so long that I could drive to Sydney, nearly 300 kilometres away, in less time than it would take to watch this. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What is this film actually about? We start with an unintentionally hilarious motorcycle crash in which our protagonist is unceremoniously killed. At his funeral, we learn the identity of this man and a glimmer of his historical importance.
He was a poet, a scholar, and a mighty warrior.
Thank you.
He was also the most shameless exhibitionist since Barnum and Bailey.
It's time now for an extended full movie flashback. T.E. Lawrence is a British soldier stationed in a military base in Cairo in the First World War. He's such a weird, undisciplined soldier that the general doesn't know what to do with him, occupying him with menial tasks like colouring in a map? Hell, that looks pretty sweet. If I were Lawrence, I'd sit there and do that for the rest of the movie. In any case, Lawrence's destiny lies far beyond decorative cartography, and he manages to persuade a superior that it would be advantageous for him to work alongside a Bedouin Arab army in driving the enemy Turkish out of the Arabian Peninsula, or Arabia as they call it at the time. Then follows a quest in which Lawrence joins other military leaders from various Arabic tribes, rides across a lot of deserts, suffers from a grand white saviour complex and thinks that he can take over the whole of the Arabian Peninsula on behalf of the Arabs. Sadly, it turns out that Lawrence is just one white guy sitting on a camel, and after experiencing a good degree of trauma and realising that war is actually kind of violent, Lawrence goes insane. Eventually, the Arabs, led by Lawrence, take over Damascus, but it turns out that they don't really know how to run a unified and efficient government. The British, as exhausted as the audience by this point, are like, oh whatever, we don't even care anymore. And then the movie ends. To really understand what exactly is the deal with Lawrence of Arabia, we need to consider so many things. Mostly the history and, well, how the film portrays just about everything really. Considering that this particular theatre of the First World War isn't commonly discussed in history classes or depicted in movies, there's a lot to cover. There were several fronts in the First World War. Most familiar and most commonly depicted was the trench warfare of the Western Front. However, while the Allied powers were fighting the Germans in Europe, they were also fighting the Turks. One of these battles, Gallipoli, is familiar to Australians to the point of nausea. But while we have the actual event drummed into us, we're never really taught why we were fighting the Turkish anyway. What even was that? The Ottoman Empire had formed a secret 1914 alliance with the Germans, mostly to regain some territories they had lost in previous conflicts, in a colonialist streak that wasn't really that different to many of the British Empire's own interests. In the First World War, nobody really gets to claim the moral high ground. The British were not big on this, mostly because they didn't want the Ottoman Empire to capture all of the oil fields and reduce their access to all that newly needed petroleum, which they had exclusive rights to under the precursor to BP. As a consequence, there was a British presence in the Middle East as well as a Turkish presence. In 1916, the Arab Revolt began, initiated by Sheriff Hussein bin Ali, who is confusingly not the Sheriff Ali depicted in this film. His aim was to create a single unified Arab state, from Syria to Yemen. The British and the French subsidised this revolt against the Ottoman Empire, and Lawrence was involved in the organisation and mobilisation of troops. He was not the only Westerner representing the Allied cause in Arabia, but he was the one with the best publicity. Hence, this movie. Another person who was heavily involved was Gertrude Bell, an English writer, political official, spy, archaeologist, mountain climber, and generally pretty intrepid person. Bell worked in intelligence and established close relations with many of the individual tribes in the Arabic Peninsula. She also witnessed the Armenian genocide and helped establish Iraq. Overall, a pretty important person in the history of Western relations with the Middle East, but she wasn't mentioned at all. No one's ever heard of Bell of Arabia. What gives? Well, probably the fact that Gertrude Bell worked in intelligence, whereas T.E. Lawrence was publicised by an American reporter, Lowell Thomas, and became a hit in the media. Granted, Gertrude Bell's got her own movie now, which has just come out, so maybe more people will realise who she is. T.E. Lawrence is also in that movie, played by Arpats. Arpats. Oh god, the horrible Little Ashes memories have come flooding back. Speaking of uncomfortable memories, there's something uncomfortable about Lawrence of Arabia, like when you're remembering reading Tintin books as a child, and then suddenly realise that there were practically no female characters in them. In fact, there's so many odd, uncomfortable things about this film that I've got gender hipster here primarily to share the discomfort. That means if I don't want to say something out loud, for whatever reason, that I can just palm it off onto someone else. First, let's get the obvious things out of the way. This is a film that has numerous characters who are people of colour. However, the majority of the lead actors are not, with Omar Sharif being the only exception. Yes, this is a film that features unfortunate brownface. At the time, this was acceptable, and these portrayals definitely aren't the worst depictions of Middle Eastern people out there. At least they're given some kind of character development and dimension beyond simply being comic or evil stereotypes. Lawrence definitely believes himself to be the saviour of the Arabs, but as the campaign goes on, he begins to realise that he isn't magical or powerful or more worthy than anyone else, and he can't single-handedly maintain control of anything.
You lead them. They're yours. Trust your own people. And let me go back to mine.
But more on that later. However, it raises an uncomfortable issue, which still persists, in the form of white men going to the Middle East in order to join armies and fight in foreign wars, almost as if they believe that somehow they will be more successful at fighting for Middle Eastern causes than the Middle Eastern people themselves. What's worse? To ignore and dismiss the validity of a culture and force your own values upon it, values which you clearly believe to be superior? Or to appropriate and fetishise someone else's culture and somehow believe that you can be a better representative of it than the people themselves. You won't find the answer in Lawrence of Arabia, but it's definitely an example of people of colour not even being properly represented in their own story. The film had the full support of King Hussein of Jordan, but it's still a highly dubious relic of its time, and if the film were made today, I would definitely hope that Middle Eastern actors would be cast instead. Speaking of odd relics of a time, this film fails the Bechdel test more than practically any other movie in existence. There are no female characters in Lawrence of Arabia. Not one, during the whole of its nearly 4-hour running time. Forget named characters who have conversations with each other, there are no female characters who even speak a single word of dialogue. Not even Gertrude Bell shows up, which is unrealistic as hell as she was all up in this conflict and worked alongside Lawrence in the maps room before he got deployed to the field.
Who the bloody hell is this Gertrude Bell?
So am I just talking about this as a period piece? After all, it definitely qualifies. Yes. However, Lawrence of Arabia is also considered to be more than a little homoerotic. I say considered, but not really by me. Try as I might, I struggle to find much that was gay about this, and if anyone's going to read homoerotic themes into something, it's going to be me. Admittedly, there's a few lines of dialogue which could be interpreted as Lawrence feeling different because of his sexuality.
You're the kind of creature I can't stand, Lawrence.
A man can do whatever he wants. You said.
He can, but he can't want what he wants.
Also, the relationship between Lawrence and Sheriff Ali could potentially be read as gay, with shots of Ali that mimic shots typically used to introduce a female love interest, Ali frequently tucking Lawrence in at night, and a scene at the end where he admits that he loves Lawrence.
He is your friend?
Your hand away.
You love him?
No, I fear him.
Then why do you weep?
If I fear him who love him, how must he fear himself who hates himself?
However, there's not a lot of evidence that this relationship is particularly romantic. Compared to other films of the period, or even before, there's barely anything here. Hell, even your standard buddy action movie depicts a much closer and more physical bond between men than anything seen here. David Lean apparently tried to depict a certain degree of homoeroticism, but it's so subtle that you almost need binoculars to see it. Or maybe I needed to watch it in the cinema. But this isn't the only kind of homoeroticism in the film, not by far. No, there's another kind entirely, a kind I did notice. Uncomfortable homoeroticism. Give me a minute, I need to change my shirt. Lawrence is weird and aloof for the most part, but there are some people whom he appears a lot more openly affectionate with. His servant boys. Faraj and Daud are cuddled and cosseted by Lawrence, and he takes a particular interest in them. It's not an attraction I want to infer, but there's the distinct possibility that it's there. Lawrence confesses that he hates killing, and gives a strange reason why.
I killed 2 people. There was something about it I didn't like.
Well, naturally.
No, something else.
What then?
I enjoyed it.
This indication of a sadomasochistic bloodlust gives the scene where he shoots Faraj a new kind of weird, perverted dimension. And speaking of sadomasochism and dubious consent, a real turning point in the film is a scene where Lawrence hubristically infiltrates the city of Daraa, believing that he will be somehow immune from detection by the occupying Turks, despite the fact that he sticks out like, well, the whitest man in the country.
Do you not see how they look at you? Come!
Peace, Ali. I am invisible.
Unsurprisingly, the Turks notice him, capturing him. What follows is a scene where the Turkish bey tears Lawrence's clothing asunder, flirts with him, and when rebuffed, orders him to be whipped, an activity that just about everyone seems to find disturbingly arousing. Much like Blue Velvet, there's also a very strong implication that this capture ends with a rape.
Your skin is very fair.
This is one of the most effective scenes in the movie, portraying a moment where Lawrence has the horrifying realisation that this is something that he cannot charm or bluff his way out of.
Do you think I'm just anybody, Ali? Do you?
He's not an impervious god. He's vulnerable and out of place, and in a sense does not belong here.
Eat. You have a body, like other men.
However, in reality, this might not have actually happened. Okay, let me explain. Aside from his military importance, one of the most frequently debated and discussed elements of T.E. Lawrence's life is the man's sexuality. There's even a whole separate play about it, as well as numerous exceptionally lame jokes, mostly revolving around Peter O'Toole's portrayal and his admittedly fabulous inexplicable eye makeup. Upon seeing the film, Noel Coward told Peter O'Toole, "If you'd been any prettier, it would have been Florence of Arabia." Wow, that was terrible. I can't decide whether that was a really terrible come-on or an atrocious hack comedian joke. Or both. Anyway, the real Lawrence has been variously described as asexual or gay, and not many people seem to be able to agree on whether or not he had any relationships. There's a rumour that he was married to a woman once, and there's also a theory that he was in love with someone named Dahum, who worked alongside him at an archaeological dig before the war. Oh, and did I mention that Dahum was a boy at the time? Turns out that those pederastic themes in the film may not have been entirely off base. No matter his relationships or lack thereof in real life, Lawrence at least seemed to be pretty chill about other people being gay, corresponding with various notable queer luminaries, and describing male-male relationships in letters to his friends as the openness and honesty of perfect love and, oh boy, I definitely can't do this justice, friends quivering together in the yielding sand, with intimate hot limbs and supreme embrace. That was the gayest sentence known to man. Even if I'd spent the entire running time of this film sitting here and trying to write something gayer, it would be completely unachievable. I've got nothing. It can't be topped. Lawrence, you magnificent bastard! Anyway, so amazing descriptions of homosexuality aside, people seem unclear whether Lawrence actually did anything sexual ever. One thing most people seem to agree on is his penchant for masochism.
Oh! It damn well hurts.
Certainly it hurts.
Well, what's the trick then?
The trick, William Potter, is not minding that it hurts.
Apparently he was particularly fond of being whipped. Sure, okay. Now why do I mention this? Remember this scene? Well, as pivotal as it may have been in the course of the movie, there's debate about whether or not this actually happened. Lawrence definitely relates being whipped and assaulted in some way in one of his books, but while many believe he was telling the truth, other scholars have stated that there's no evidence for the assault, concluding instead that this was simply a very elaborate sexual fantasy Lawrence had written himself into. So yes, either this scene is an actual traumatic occurrence in Lawrence's life, or David Lean unwittingly just filmed T.E. Lawrence's porn. Look, I'm not going to say anything further about this because I don't know. While we're on the subject of homosexuality in Lawrence of Arabia, I may as well discuss how it would have been viewed by the actual native inhabitants of the country. Like other Abrahamic religions, Islam does have some anti-gay teachings, essentially based on the same tale of Sodom and Gomorrah that fuels so many Christian condemnations of alleged sexual aberration. Unfortunately, in many modern-day Islamic countries in the Middle East, being gay can be very dangerous indeed. However, in Lawrence of Arabia, the Arabian Peninsula was still under the control of the Ottoman Empire, who had legalised homosexuality in 1858. The separation of women from men and the general homosocial nature of Middle Eastern society also meant that there was a culture of pederasty, similar to the ancient Greeks, with specific words describing younger male partners. Add to this the general situational sexuality of many armies, and one can see why Lawrence would have felt that he had found refuge in a society more open about homosexuality. Not that you really see any of it in this movie, which can be best described as not gay enough. One thing this film does handle very well is its depiction of trauma. We are shown Lawrence reacting to several traumatic events throughout the movie, from having to kill to the deaths of his servants and witnessing a village slain. But his one main breaking point is his assault and probable rape in Daraa. He first goes into shock, having difficulty eating and sleeping. As he regains his physical health, he tries to avoid his former friends and fellow soldiers, holding up in Cairo and distancing himself from his involvement in the Arabic campaign.
You're the most extraordinary man I ever met.
Leave me alone.
What?
Leave me alone.
Later, when he goes back into battle, he behaves vastly more violently than he had previously, trying to match the brutality of the Turkish army.
Enough! Enough! Make them stop!
When it comes time to take over Damascus, Lawrence is incredibly exhausted and disillusioned. It rings incredibly true to the reality of PTSD, and is probably one of the things that the film does best.
Is it the blood? The desert has dried up more blood than you could think of.
I pray that I may never see the desert again.
So should you watch it? My first reaction to this film was an 1,000-kilometre stare of sheer exhaustion. Words cannot describe the pacing of David Lean's, well, I'd call it a magnum opus, but David Lean made several films that were this long, which makes me think that audiences back in the 1960s had a different perception of time. I watched the restored cut, which clocks in at 3 hours and 40 minutes long, and starts with a solid 4 minutes of a completely black screen with music playing. Then and only then do we get the credits. The first 90 minutes were actually very enjoyable. One cannot understate how well this film is made. The visuals are fantastic, the music is stirring, and the editing is legendarily brilliant, with a particularly notable literal match cut. As someone who edits, it's hard not to admire and appreciate someone who does the invisible arts so well, particularly when the editor, Anne V. Coates, had to deal with such a fittingly epic amount of footage. At this stage, the story is compelling enough to grab the audience, and Peter O'Toole's strange theatrical effeminate alien performance as Lawrence certainly held my attention. However, by the third hour, the film had definitely worn out its welcome. I began to feel some kind of second-hand combat strain as the desert continued to be so deserty, the cast continued to be dusty, and Peter O'Toole presumably became more and more drunk. Apparently making this film took so long that in this particular scene, when Lawrence walks down a staircase, Peter O'Toole started the shot at the top of the stairs and was 1 year older by the time he got to the bottom. I too feel like I'm a year older. I could fly to another country in less time than it would take to watch this film. Now, I've definitely watched long films before for the show. Barry Lyndon is long enough to have an intermission and has the same kind of glacial pacing, with scenes frequently showing characters walk the entire length of a ballroom in one single shot. But there's just something about Lawrence of Arabia, some kind of crippling chronic exhaustion, a desert madness. We feel as if we too have been suffocated in sand or battered under the sun's anvil. There's no other way to describe watching Lawrence of Arabia than comparing it to some kind of trauma, a vastly overwhelming experience that makes you frantically seek out thoughts or reviews of other people, in a desperate desire to know and confirm that other people understand how you feel. Whatever it is that you feel. To help understand what the hell I sat through, I can only reach for other films. Apocalypse Now captures people going completely insane on the battlefield in a heady, dark 1970s nightmare. It's not a complete comparison, but it immerses you in a world in much the same way. Unlike Lawrence of Arabia, when you've finished watching it, you feel as if you've gone through some kind of indescribable ordeal. Also, didn't I talk about some other film about a British soldier called Lawrence acting as a go-between in a foreign country before? Oh yeah! Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence was apparently partially inspired by Lawrence of Arabia, and also shows the uncomfortable and difficult interaction between several different cultures, with Lawrence attempting to help both groups come to some kind of understanding.
Why will you not fight me? If you defeat me, you will be free.
Also, a key figure in the film is a tall blonde man who comes across as extremely foreign and fascinating to those around him. There's a whole bunch of men thrown into a situation together, and there's the same feeling of moral ambiguity and eventual despair. But I prefer Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence for its better pacing and more complex narrative.
You're the victim of men who think that they're right. And the truth is, of course, that nobody's right.
Here, no white man has the balance of power. There can be no white saviour. At best, our white character is a spanner in the works. The film is also a lot queerer. Rather than being a weird, incidental, barely there element, Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence revolves entirely around falling in love with someone you desperately want to hate. Plus, this is a film that's definitely more culturally accurate, featuring Japanese actors speaking their own language, and no unfortunate brownface. And while the other film might have Peter O'Toole twirling around an eyeliner, this film has David Bowie. I think that's an upgrade. If you must see it in a cinema where you'll be able to really take in the fantastic visuals. But then again, if you see it in a cinema, you won't be able to escape. I guess you could just watch the other movie, the one where he's played by our Pats. So that was Lawrence of Arabia. And now, if you'll excuse me, I feel outmatched and defeated, and I've got to prove myself worthy somehow. Game, set and match, Lawrence. I've got to go and write a gayer sentence.